Hello, my name is Deborah Russell. I'm happy you all are watching this videotape. This videotape is about consecutive interpreting. Later you will see some interpreters using consecutive interpreting, and you can discuss how that applies to our field. Consecutive interpreting means taking turns interpreting from one language to another, but not at the same time. It's listening to a message and then putting it out in the second language. Some people think it means lag time, like waiting a little bit and then speaking. But it's waiting until one message is over and then relaying it in the second message. During consecutive interpreting, the interpreter sometimes uses notes or draws some sort of map to look at to be able to expand on the interpretation from the notes. During consecutive interpreting, the interpreter must have a way to have the presenter hold for a moment while they're relaying the message. If you look back in history, it's interesting to note that spoken languages prove that consecutive interpreting is more accurate and more precise. The proof is there, but interpreting in sign language, we tend to use simultaneous interpreting more often. This is because our language uses signs and spoken language, and that can be done at the same time. With two spoken languages, you can't have two people speaking at the same time, you have to wait. But in our language, it's different. It can be done simultaneously. And if you look at the history of interpreting, there hasn't been a lot of analysis as far as whether consecutive interpreting works. And if you look at the testing process as well, all of the testings and screenings for interpreting use simultaneous. There are many myths in regards to consecutive interpreting. Some people think that consecutive interpreting is learned first and then simultaneous interpreting later. But people in this field know that simultaneous interpreting is learned first. Some people think consecutive interpreting means the interpreter is not very skilled. Some deaf people might say, consecutive interpreting looks like what my child does, interpreting for me. Others think that simultaneous interpreting is faster, so that means it's better. But that's not always the case. Our field has a lot of new research. My PhD is about court interpreting. I researched 4 trials with criminal charges. They all had teams of interpreters with national certification and experience in the courtroom. I analyzed 3 situations during the trial: an expert witness, a deaf person giving a testimony, and a cross-examination. Consecutive interpreting was more accurate than simultaneous interpreting. There was an 87 and 83% success rate, while consecutive there was a 97 and 95% success rate. In Spanish-English interpreting, the research proves that simultaneous interpreting numbers are low in comparison to consecutive. So in this situation, consecutive interpreting is more accurate. So in the 3 situations, the expert witness during the court, almost 10% of their information was incorrect during the interpretation. If you look at the deaf testimony, 39 errors out of 189 statements. That means over 20% of their story was wrong. And for the questioning, there were 15 errors out of 188 statements. So that's pretty strong evidence that a lot of errors occurred during simultaneous interpreting. The type of errors that occurred during simultaneous interpreting was a lot of omission. That's because it's difficult to retain all the information while speaking, so a lot of things are omitted. Or with incorrect timing. If a person was telling a story that happened in the past, the interpreter would speak as if it was occurring in the present. So the people wouldn't trust the deaf person's story because it was confusing. There was also shifts in register. The lawyer would be speaking formal English, and the interpreter would be signing what looked like everyday, casual ASL. Sometimes the interpreter would speak English that sounded good, but it didn't match what the deaf person was saying. Or sometimes the grammatical structure of ASL was not there. It didn't look like ASL, and it didn't look like contact sign, which means the deaf person had to try and figure out what the interpreter meant. The interpreter tends to follow English sentence structure, word for word. But during consecutive interpreting, the same interpreter will use a more natural sign language and more natural ASL. Another error was during spoken English, which was very awkward. The interpreter was watching and speaking at the same time, but the spoken message always needed to be corrected. So it sounded awkward, it wasn't fluid, and so that the people would look at the deaf person as if they were confusing their story, when really it was the fault of the interpreter. Other errors during the narrative structure, during the narrative structure in simultaneous interpreting.